So what we want to talk about today is pornography, and the morality of it. Now, I will be absolutely honest when I say I really wish we were in class talking about this together, because it is so much more fun to do that when half of the people are very awkward with this topic. I can kind of enjoy that. I know that sounds kind of mean, but that's just kind of the way it is. I made the mistake once in a previous semester of going through the list of different topics and using the metaphor that we were going to be looking at those topics. We're going to look at capital punishment, we're going to look at abortion, we're going to look at porn, and then I had to correct myself and no, we're literally not doing that. I'm assuming that you all know what pornography is. Um, I'm not going to suggest that you go out and try to find it. Don't necessarily Google it. We're going to give some definitions. We're going to talk a little bit about um, what its parameters are and how people have defined it and how, really, frankly, different philosophers define it. I mean, specifically, even today, we're going to look at how Altman himself defines it. It's an ongoing conversation regarding the morality of pornography. And I say that because, at least within the context of the United States, pornography has become just more widespread, more available. It is, I guess, probably the best way to put it is that there's been a massive proliferation of it, and of course, the internet is what has done that. Not that I'm some old fogey, but I do remember a time when about the only place you could access pornography was in certain kinds of bookstores or certain kinds of movie rental places back when we had VHS, of all things, videotapes. And some video rental stores would have a back room filled with pornographic titles that you had to show your ID to go back there and uh, take a gander at that stuff and to check out whatever you want. Right, very, very much regulated, very much tried to be discreet about that, and even then it was controversial. Statistics showed that places like that, there often was a little bit higher of a crime rate in those particular neighborhoods. It may have to do with the neighborhoods that those shops were put in, just to begin with. I don't know. I'm not going to get into all that because I really don't know. But I think it's fair to say, at least, that pornography is much more widespreadly available. Indeed, I even had a particular instance in a supersection class when I taught at the University of Alberta many years ago. I had about 300 students in an introduction to philosophy course. And during one of the lectures in our big lecture hall, I saw a commotion going on in the back row of that lecture hall. And I just kept on lecturing through whatever, no problem, whatever the deal is. And later on, a colleague came to me and said that 3 of my students sitting in the very back row of that lecture hall were actually viewing porn during class. And someone complained, and so security came and got them, and I think they ended up being suspended for that semester from the university because viewing pornography in a context like that constitutes a sexual harassment violation. And in Canada, which is where the University of Alberta is, sexual harassment is a criminal infraction. In other words, it's a crime there. In the U.S., sexual harassment is not a crime; it's a civil matter. So people sue each other over it here in our country. In Canada, it's a criminal offense. So I think they were brought up on criminal charges. I never did really follow that, probably like I should have. I was too busy writing a dissertation. But anyway, right? I mean, right here in a classroom, people are not just on Facebook and messing around on iTunes. They're watching porn. Kind of fascinating, isn't it? I mean, this is how things are, frankly. This is how I think even the current generation is very much okay with pornography as another form of media, as another form, or just a variety of entertainment, just like anything else can be a kind of entertainment. Okay? That's just where we're at in culture. The question is that morally okay? Is it morally right? Or is there something incredibly morally nefarious about pornography. I think it's important to talk about this topic. A course like this one, that in which we're in, allows us the opportunity to talk about it. And I think because it's so controversial, because there is just the mass of anti-porn material that's out there. For instance, I was looking around on YouTube the last few days and online, frankly, looking for some interesting short videos that I could show of someone giving an argument for sort of the morality of it or even the benefits of pornography. I really can't find anything. There's mass amounts of stuff that is out there to argue against porn, to help people get out of porn addiction. It seems like the vast majority of non-pornography discussions or talks or videos about pornography are completely against it. I find that very fascinating. So if that's the case, why is it that so many people view it? There are 3 pornography sites, and I'll not mention which ones, but the last time I checked, there are 3 pornography sites that are within the scope of the top 10 websites that are accessed in the United States. Now, I want to say something like these pornography sites being in the top 10, they outrank things even like Wikipedia. They outrank, I don't think they outrank Google, but I think they outrank Yahoo. They outrank, what was another one that I found interesting? Anyway, I shouldn't be trying to remember this from memory. I should have had the paper in front of me. But think about that. Of all the websites that people access in the world, I'm sorry, in the United States, in the top 10, 3 of the top 10 are pornography sites. So it's big business, right? It's a big media in that sense. So we've got to keep that in mind. Now, whose argument are we looking at today? I'm going to talk about, well, Dr. Andrew Altman, who is a philosopher at Georgia State University in Atlanta. And he takes what we would call the traditional liberal position. And I want to be very clear in terms of what that means. In saying that Altman is taking a liberal position, a capital L liberal position, frankly, what that is an American position. We're using the term liberal here as in its classical sense, not liberal in terms of having sort of progressive political policies or an agenda. So not the way in which we use the term liberal in our century, frankly, nowadays. We usually talk about liberal being the ideology or the political philosophy of those on what we would call the political left, or sometimes those that would identify maybe with the Democratic Party. Not always, right? But that's oftentimes how that term is being used, even derogatorily. Liberals will be called certain things in that sense. But that has nothing to do with what we're talking about here in terms of a traditional liberal or really a classical liberal position. A classical liberal position is one, frankly, which argues or which holds that that people have a right to make decisions and choices for themselves. In this sense, those who founded the United States, those who wrote the Declaration of Independence, and those who formed the Constitution of the United States are liberals. They're capital L liberals. They're classical liberals. In that they argued that people could govern themselves just fine, and indeed they had a right from God to do so. That's what Jefferson and Washington and Hamilton and Jay and Madison, that's what these people argued in the 18th century, right? And it was considered liberal because the governing powers themselves are liberally spread out, are liberally given out, right, to the populace, to the citizens of that country. That's really what liberal means in this sense. So they rejected this idea that a particular monarch, that is the King of England, right, that that particular monarch had some divine right given by God to rule over his people, right? They rejected that idea. They thought that was crazy talk. They did not believe that was right at all. That really the best government is one that is governed by the people themselves, where the people themselves really engage in self-rule over themselves and do so in a way such that certain rights and privileges would be guaranteed, such that the people just couldn't change their mind about them at any time. That's which is what the Constitution is. The Constitution is just sort of this basic, fundamental position that cannot change. Um, then outside of that Constitution, people can do whatever they wish to do regarding passing laws or policies or just living their individual lives. This indeed is the traditional liberal position that one may do whatever they wish, right? One may govern their lives however they wish, with only really one caveat. It is so long that you are respecting other people's rights. Okay. In other words, you're not harming them. You're not harming their rights. You're not violating the rights that they have, basic human rights as well as constitutional legal rights. Okay. That's the traditional liberal position. And that's the position that Altman takes. So if indeed you take that position, how do you apply that position to pornography? Well, the way that Altman is doing it is he's saying that pornography really is, and of course we're going to get into more details about this. What he's saying is that pornography really is just the sort of thing that people can decide themselves whether to view or to consume, to engage in, either as someone producing or creating pornography or consuming it by viewing it in some way. So that's his basic position, really. An important John Stuart Mill quote here to sort of give a sense of this traditional liberal position. Mill says, in the part which merely concerns himself, that is just any human being, any person, his independence is of right absolute. Over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. And it's that kind of idea, it's that kind of conviction that Altman is bringing into this discussion regarding the morality of pornography. Well, let's ask one question, sort of get it out of the way, because Altman himself says that he doesn't want to premise his argument in favor of pornography, or at least in favor of people's right to consume it or create it, to engage in it. He doesn't want to make this all about an issue regarding porn being freedom of speech. That's not his argument whatsoever. So is porn freedom of speech? Altman says no, or at least he doesn't want to take that particular tack in engaging this topic. That has been a question that has been brought up before the Supreme Court of the United States. A very famous case in 1973, Miller v. California. There was an issue there where there was a guy named Henry Miller that had went throughout neighborhoods putting flyers in people's door handles advertising his porn shop. It's kind of an interesting idea. The guy's trying to drum up some business, not for his grass cutting business or clean out your garage sort of business, but he's opened up a porn shop and he wants people to come buy his products. And it made a lot of people mad. I mean, he went to some nice, upscale bedroom communities, people pretty conservative that live in those neighborhoods, those subdivisions, and he's advertising porn. You've got 8, 9-year-old kids going out and seeing these flyers in people's door and their door handles advertising the porn shop. Hey, mommy, what is this? Right? So it made a lot of people mad, and they called the police. And of course, eventually, he was convicted under, at the time, I'm pretty sure, under California's obscenity laws, was convicted of violating them, but then he appealed to Court of Appeals. I guess that would be the 6th District Court of Appeals. I don't know how they ruled in particular, but anyway, it came all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. The question being, was Henry Miller's right to the freedom of speech, right? Was that violated by him being convicted under California law of the obscenity laws? In other words, did the state of California violate his freedom of speech by convicting him, thus restricting him of being able to disseminate these flyers advertising his porn shop? And the Supreme Court said, well, no, that's not what happened. His freedom of speech has not been violated because pornography itself is not to be protected under one's First Amendment right to free speech. Okay, but what they said at the same time was that, however, in other words, porn has nothing to do with your First Amendment rights to free speech. However, states may regulate this as they see fit. They may regulate this in terms of what their particular needs are, how they want to define obscenity, how they might be tackling some issues like this. Okay, so pretty much Altman's saying, whether it's people have a right to free speech regarding pornography or not is really not the right way to look at this issue. That gets us into left field. That gets us way out there into some barrels of worms that just aren't worth in any way diving through, because the whole free speech thing is a thorny issue anyway. Rather, what Altman says is that one's right to porn should be understood in terms of sexual autonomy. That this notion of sexual autonomy indeed is a moral right that people have. Indeed, it is the right to do anything sexually. For instance, one's choice and usage of contraception, one's decisions to engage in sexual activity outside of marriage or not. This is something that is very much discouraged in certain communities in our country. That's something that would have been more so discouraged, I think, in the past. It's less and less being discouraged, and you're starting to see voices in our society saying that people actually should engage in sex outside of marriage, or at least prior to marriage. And that's one of the interesting things that I see about these voices and some of these arguments is that before you get married, engage in all of it that you can, learn about yourself, yada yada yada. Then once you get married, right, then you shouldn't anymore. And so, of course, I kind of wonder, well, how consistent then is that, right? This is sort of arbitrarily then. If you think that there's really nothing morally undergirding this activity itself, then why are you arbitrarily saying that at marriage you should? Anyway, I won't get on that topic, but that's the sort of issue that we're dealing with here. That sexual autonomy really includes everything: right? Contraception, sex outside of marriage, sex with a partner of one's choice, of course, with the caveat that they consent as well. That you're just not picking somebody and saying, I want to have sex with you. They would need to actually affirm that and reciprocate with their consent as well. If not, that's called sexual assault, and you don't want to do that. I promise you. This is the idea that Altman has here, is that we should be thinking about the right to pornography then, indeed, as being sort of under this overarching umbrella of sexual autonomy. That is as basic of a human right, that is as fundamental of a right that persons have as anything else. Now, maybe there's not a constitutional amendment that recognizes that, but for people like Altman, that's not necessary. Right? It's still a fundamental right. It's still a basic right that people have. And this is how the right to porn should be understood. Yes, and again, right, are there limits to this? Well, the limits that Altman himself notes are children and non-consenting adults. Right? This particular right that a person has does not extend beyond these particular parameters. So this does not include children. It definitely does not include non-consenting adults. Well, what is pornography? It's an interesting question to ask. Speaking of the Supreme Court of the United States, many years ago there was a case brought up, and I'm pretty sure it was the same case I mentioned, Miller v. California. There was a prior case, Memoirs v. Massachusetts, that may have been in that case, but in one of the others, it was noted Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart at the time was trying to give a legal definition of pornography, or I guess he was rejecting the idea that you could give any kind of definition, and all he said in one of his opinions was that porn is the sort of thing that you can't really define. Just you know it when you see it, right? And he left it at that. Well, it might be true that porn is the sort of thing that you know what it is when you see it. However, Altman's going to try to give a bit more of a definition of it, and I think he actually gives a good one here. I think this is a helpful definition of pornography, to just sort of give it as a technical definition. And here's how he does it. He says that porn is explicit or sexually explicit material. And by that, it could be words or images. Pornography and words, we often talk about or use the term erotica to describe that. Or images, which are probably the most popular ones, whether photographs or videos, the sorts of things you can access on the internet, which are very popular. which is intended by its creators to excite sexually those who are willing viewers of the material. All right, so this is a really fascinating definition, I think. You have to think of the viewer then here, the person who views, right, or reads, I suppose, in the case of erotica, um, as a consumer. Right? They're the ones who are purchasing this material. Okay, so they're a consumer of it. They're consuming this media like they would consume any other kind of media. Of course, you might say, well, but so much of internet porn is free, right? Well, fair enough, but they're still consuming it. Somebody is paying for it. I suppose there's certain maybe advertisers or something that are actually paying for the material, and they pay, and the more views that particular pages get, the more that they pay then for that, right? Because their products are being advertised out there. So that's really important. And so if pornography, or if someone who's consuming pornography indeed is a consumer of it, what it means then is that porn really is a commodity. It's really something that's bought and sold on the market, just like anything else is bought and sold on the market. This morning I bought some diesel fuel for my truck. Bought it on the open market, paid $1.91. I thought it was a pretty good price. Also bought a coffee before I got into work today, right? I'm a consumer of these things. These things are commodities to me. Well, what is it that we expect when we purchase things? Well, we expect them to give us what we're looking for, to give us what it is that we are wanting to get out of that. So when people produce products for us, they're producing them with the intent that they satisfy some need that we have. This is just sort of basic economics, I suppose. Basic sort of transactional economics when we think about it. Well, porn is the same way, according to Altman. So what do people intend when they are creating and producing this commodity of pornography? Well, they're intending to satisfy the needs of the consumers that they have for arousal. That's what consumers expect. They expect to be aroused by pornography. If that's not the case, then I guess it's bad porn, maybe. I don't know. Maybe I don't want to get too deep into that idea to try to figure out what the difference between good and bad porn in terms of its effects on the consumer. Basically, the idea is that the intention of this product, and thus how the product is made, how it's presented, everything about its production is intended to arouse the consumer so that this particular commodity of the porn itself will be bought and bought and bought, purchased and purchased and purchased, on and on and on, just like any sort of market product. So we can think of examples that indeed would help us sort of understand this idea pretty obviously. For instance, I'm not suggesting that you do this whatsoever, but if you were to view a pornographic website and then go to WebMD, you might get similar images or diagrams for completely different purposes. Okay, the pornographic website is going to have commodities on it that indeed are intended to arouse you sexually. The WebMD pages may have some explicit diagrams, maybe even some photos. They're definitely not going for the goal of turning you on, right, sexually. Rather, the idea is that they're trying to educate you about your body. So we might have the same or very similar kinds of things on these two different resources, a porn site and WebMD, but the intent is very different. Okay? So maybe that helps sort of illustrate what's going on here. Another point to be said about this then too, and this is becoming, I think, more and more of a fascinating kind of thing, is that because porn itself is a consumer commodity, it is a media commodity, just like news and sports and movies and TV shows and Netflix, right, and Disney Plus, and because all of these are media commodities, and porn is right alongside those as a media commodity. Well, then, different kind of porn is created for different kinds of consumers, right? There's different categories, there's different genres, there's different sorts of plots, if there is a plot in some of these things, just like there is with different kinds of movies or different kinds of TV shows, right? On and on, different kinds of music, right? So all these sort of overarching things have various genres, various categories, and it applies as well to pornography. And you get that in a free market. You get that in an open market where things are bought and sold. Also, another thing that Altman notes then is that most porn is directed at male consumers. Right? Most most porn is directed at men being the ones who purchase, right? Men being the ones who make that transaction. Uh, that's becoming less and less the case. I don't have the data in front of me, but something that I saw within the last 6 months, some data actually showed that the fastest growing demographic of internet pornography are women between the ages of 18 and 30. I think men are still the overwhelming consumers of it. That really hasn't changed. So the other demographic, however, that's growing the fastest is women between 18 and 30, which I think is interesting. Joseph asks, well, what about art? Some in the past especially have tried to chastise certain paintings or sculptures as pornography. Yeah, I mean, that's a very good and interesting question. And I think that's actually sort of an easy question to answer if we take Altman's definition of porn as a good one. So if we're using his definition here, it would depend on what the intent of that particular art is, or depend on what those particular sculptures are. If their purpose indeed is to arouse, is to incite somebody sexually, well, then they would be pornographic according to his definition. If that's not their intent, if their intent maybe is to display what the artist sees in terms of just the gloriousness or the beauty of the human body, then that's probably not going to be right pornographic. If he's displaying, or she, right, the artist is displaying two people, going at it like rabbits, that's probably going to be pornography, right? So forgive me for using that term. That's right. That's probably what's going on here. But again, right, it would depend on the definition. But I think that's where the definition of porn, whichever one you think is best, will help us sort of adjudicate between certain kinds of product. But that's a good question. I mean, that's sometimes a fine line. At what point does pornography become art, or at what point does art become pornography? Right? The grand statue of David, standing there in all of his glory, is that porn? I don't think so. Even though nothing is really left to the imagination, with the famous statue of David, the artist has a different intent in mind with that. It's to display sort of the gloriousness, the grandeur, the authority of this Hebrew figure, David, not to get people all kinds of turned on when they come and look at the sculpture. But yeah, that's a great question. One of the things that Altman himself is really trying to provide an alternative to, and even criticize, is what he calls traditional sexual morality. Of course, as he sees it, he sees traditional sexual morality, or at least he's trying to sort of homogenize all of sort of past restrictive views on sex from different kinds of cultures, especially in the West. So he may not be exactly right about some of these things, but he probably has a good go of it here, just to try to bring all of those sort of traditional moralities together and point out a common thread. And he says this, that under this sort of old school, historic, traditional view about sexual morality, the idea is that one's choices and actions regarding sex really aren't theirs, but they're under the imposition of all kinds of duties and rules. In other words, under traditional sexual morality, people really don't get to make their own choices regarding how they engage in sexual activity, but frankly, they're expected to just follow the rules that are imposed on them, to follow the duties that are imposed on them by others, whether they're families or their societies, their communities, their religions, whatever, right, what have you. That these are not their choices to make, but others' choices to make on them, to more or less control their sexual lives. So in other words, I don't really get to be in control of my sexual life. I'm supposed to live it out as people tell me sort of how to do that, as I'm expected to be a good member of my particular community, whatever that is. Um, and by the way, this photo here I found is kind of interesting. I forgot the name of this, but this was a practice that was done many years ago in colonial America for a very brief time. The idea was that before a young man and a woman were to be married, while they were still engaged, they would be encouraged to sleep together in the same bed just to sort of get used to it before they got married. And of course, they put this divider up there to effectively disallow or to discourage any hanky-panky from going on. Well, guess what happened? Yeah, what they found out after a year of this practice was that the divider really didn't work. And so they quit the practice altogether. Oh, that was kind of interesting. Anyway, so traditional sexual morality here. But even then, that practice right there is not really all that traditional. That would actually be a pretty progressive practice in the 18th century, 17th and 18th centuries. So anyway, traditional sexual morality, I don't make my own choices regarding sex. I'm just expected to follow the rules that my community imposes on me. Well, what's a liberal criticism of this? What's Altman's liberal criticism? Again, capital L liberal. What he argues is that this just violates people's rights. It violates them incredibly by treating people's sexual choices as if they belong to society, right? It's violating your right to make your own choices and engage in that by saying that really your sexual choices to make aren't yours to make. Those choices are for your society, it's for your community, it's for your religion, it's for your family to make for you. And as such, traditional sexual morality conscripts sex to societal interests, whatever those interests are. Traditionally, those interests have been regarding procreation. It's been about creating model families, healthy families, people would argue, according to a particular definition of that, and really not for any other reason, right? It's all about what your duties are to your community and your society. Your sexual behavior indeed should be engaged in. In other words, sort of the underlying or read between the lines here point is that your sexual activity is not for your own benefit. It's not for your own pleasure. It's not for your own enjoyment. It's all about for what society expects out of you there. Well, one interesting rebuttal that we could have to Altman here, and I'll just sort of leave it at this on this particular point, is that, isn't this what all social norms and laws do? Every law that we have, every social norm that we have, is geared towards providing for the common good of the community. At least that's the argument. Whether it actually achieves that or not is one thing, but that's what we institute them for. We already have sexual norms that are sanctioned by law. For instance, you can't have sex with minors. You can't have sex with non-consenting adults. You can't have sex in public, right? Well, why do we have these laws, and why do we prosecute people who violate these laws? Indeed, because we think that these go opposite as to the common good of our communities, right? So we already do regulate what people can and cannot do sexually. So maybe there is a fine line there somewhere. And it could take a long time to argue that out and to try to come up with some principles that would give us indeed some teeth for laying out what these norms are, instead of just arbitrarily saying that, okay, this is morally okay and this other thing is not morally okay. We don't have time to do that today, but this is something to think about, right? In other words, Altman might indeed criticize traditional sexual morality for the norms that it imposes on sexual activity, but even at the same time, in a liberal society like ours, we still have laws that regulate this sort of thing, to a certain extent anyway. So we've got to keep that in mind. What is liberal morality then? Right? We got a sense of what it means to be a classical capital L liberal, as Altman himself is. So how does this apply, as he thinks anyway, to this issue of sexual autonomy? Well, as he puts it, individuals have the right to decide for themselves when, whether, and why to engage in sexual activity. In other words, whenever they want to do it, they make that choice. Whether they want to do it or not, they make that choice. And whatever their reasons are for engaging in sexual activity, whether it's for conceiving a child, like procreation, or whether it's just for one's pleasure, or whether it's to help a friend out, or uh, arguably whether it's to maybe provide a product such as pornography or maybe even prostitution. As some people argue, under liberal morality, that should be allowed instead of outlawed in the states in which it is outlawed. Um, and indeed, this is just something that people have a right for themselves to do, just like, eating a sandwich and drinking a glass of water. This is something that you have a right to do for yourself. Okay? In this sense, then, sexual autonomy is individual. It's an individual thing. It's an individual right. It's not a collective one. So, what about porn now? How does this all apply to pornography? Well, pretty straightforward. I think, giving Altman's position already, we probably know what the answer to this is, right? It's pretty obvious. That consenting adults have the right to create and consume it. It can be actors and actresses in it, right? Or the producers, or the investors, or whatever, right? Be a part of those who make it, create it, as well as consume it, to be a consumer of it, to buy it for your own purposes and needs. Voluntary association. So consenting adults have the right to not only create and consume it, but also to associate with other people for the purpose of it, right? So sort of in strict legal terms, voluntary association often has sort of market connotations, being that, right, I have a right to associate with those who sell it, who produce it, be part of the supply chain, I guess, as well as others who might also enjoy it as well. Maybe you like it, and other people like it, and you get together and have a community porn club, right? I don't know, right? But this is the idea that Altman has here, that you have a right to associate with others for the purpose of it, especially porn. All right, so what about some criticisms then? Altman considers a few of them and then responds to them. I think these are pretty fascinating. I think the third criticism is, personally, I kind of think it's the more important one here. I think it's the one he has a more difficult time responding to. Excuse me, I had to get a sip of coffee there. But let's go through these. So one criticism that he anticipates and responds to is this criticism that says that porn should be limited because it contributes to sexual violence. In other words, we really need to regulate porn, maybe even outlaw it, because it is a major factor in sexual violence that is committed against other people, especially against women. Now, one thing that I think you need to really be careful here about, maybe that's not the right way to put it, or at least be very diligent about, is that Altman is coming from a very sort of deontological perspective. Okay, I wouldn't necessarily say he's a Kantian, but when he talks about these concepts about having a right to something and then others having a duty to respect that right, that's very Kantian. Okay, that sort of language, that sort of ideology comes out of Kant. So it really is a duty ethics here. You have a right to something, and then we all have a duty to respect that right. Indeed, that he even uses the term autonomy as being sort of a moral bedrock basis for really your life, your activity. That is Kantian. Nobody talks about autonomy before Immanuel Kant talks about autonomy in that way. He is broadly, right, coming from a Kantian framework. This particular criticism here, however, is very utilitarian, right? It's very consequentialist. Why should porn be limited, or why should it be outlawed? Is because of its consequences. So all of a sudden now we've got someone who's bringing consequences as a moral basis of a criticism in, someone who's not even arguing from that perspective. So in a sense, these criticisms, this criticism kind of talks past Altman's argument. In a sense, they don't mesh. I mean, he's going to engage these and give his response to them, but I think you need to keep in mind that criticisms like this are coming from a completely different normative framework than what Altman himself is coming from. All right, so let's get back to this criticism. Porn should be limited because it contributes to sexual violence. This particular criticism here is from Helen Longino. She is a philosopher, mostly an epistemologist, I think. I remember when I wrote my dissertation, I had studied a lot lot of her work in social epistemology and science at the University of Minnesota. I still think she's still at Minnesota. Anyway, uh, what she argues is that there are all kinds of harmful indirect effects that pornography has on non-consenting victims, right? So what does she mean by that? That there are indirect effects on people? Well, let's say, for instance, that you consume a lot of pornography. Let's even say that you like the really raunchy stuff. You like the very explicit stuff. You like the stuff where people are getting beat up and bludgeoned and bloodied and this really violent kind of pornography. One of the examples that she uses is a particular pornographic film, for instance, that depicts a gang rape of a woman or of women, and that men might watch this, they might be aroused by this, they might say, this is a great idea, let's act this out. So in a sense, then these men are somewhat acting this out, maybe on their partners, or on their girlfriends, on their wives, what have you. So what do we have in this case? What we have in this case is the fact then that women who have nothing to do with porn are nonetheless being negatively affected by it. So this is what she means by indirect. To directly harm someone, that is, for pornography to directly harm somebody, would be to harm someone who actually creates or consumes it. So here we have a third party involved in this case, where a woman is suffering the effects of it because her partner, in some sense, is being influenced by it. So what does Helen Longino say? Well, violent porn is implicated in the crimes of violence against women. She shows some data, and there are data out there to suggest that indeed that it is pretty common for women to suffer sexual violence, to be raped, to be harmed in some way by someone indeed who's a viewer and a consumer of pornography. Her conclusion then is that whatever right to porn you have, whatever that is, whatever that might be, however, that right is overridden, it's squashed by others' more important right to not be harmed by it. So if I have a right to not be harmed by it, then that is an overriding right that I have. And whatever it is, then whatever is your right to consume it, to view it. Well, how does Altman respond to this? Well, he pretty much says maybe, okay, but really, if we're going to prohibit violent porn, indeed, he doesn't make a distinction between certain kinds of porn being more morally okay than other kinds, right? Porn is porn if it's violent or not. So violent porn is simply just porn. He says if we're going to prohibit it, first of all, we need evidence really of a causal connection here. It would be helpful to have data that shows a clear-cut causal connection between pornography and violence that results from it. But the evidence is mixed. Even though pornography and sexual violence itself is rising in various places in the country, violence in general is rising. So it would seem that, and part and parcel with that, or right in step with that, is the population growth rising. It seems like if you have more people, you're going to have more violence. Just, the percentages are going to stay the same, and the aggregate number is going to grow. So along with violence, the sexual violence also would be rising, and these seem to be rising in step with one another. And secondly, we would need to justify why we're picking on porn. Why aren't we not picking on other kinds of media violence? What about slasher films? What about, what are some of those I'm thinking of? I should not admit that I know some things about. Saw or Hostel. Oh my gosh, I saw a little bit of Hostel one time on TV. It was actually being showed on a network late at night thing. I had no idea what this thing was I was watching. It was absolutely horrid. Children of the Corn, right? I'll update myself here. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, right? Why are we not also picking on these kinds of things? Or even video games, man. There's some explicit video games out there that indeed would seemingly influence our culture, influence our society, in some way or another here, right? That that would contribute to violence across our communities. So hey, let's be equal opportunity critics here and criticize this stuff as well. Well, how about a second criticism? This one doesn't have so much to do with the consequences of harm. That's not what's being imposed in this particular criticism, but the consequences of sexual inequality. I guess which itself would be a kind of harm. So let me rephrase that. Right? The first criticism then is really more about sexual violence as a harm. This criticism argues that pornography contributes to harm to women by creating sexual inequality, or at least perpetuating sexual inequality. Now, what is this criticism? How does this criticism do this? So this particular one is by philosopher Catherine MacKinnon. Altman entertains this particular criticism. What MacKinnon has argued is that what pornography does is it actually contributes to maintaining all kinds of inequalities that disadvantage women. Not the least of which are social and economic, right? But because there are social and economic inequalities that are part of this, that are contributed to by pornography, at the end of the day, this really becomes a sort of civil rights matter. And why is this the case? Well, it's the case because, as she argues, it perpetuates sort of the stereotypes, the most troublesome one being that women really are subordinate to men. That when it comes to sex, it's really the man that counts, and it's the woman who's to follow orders and be the one who provides the man's satisfaction. In other words, her job is the one of a servant. Her job is the one of making sure that the man is satisfied sexually here. And so much pornography does indeed do that. It's all about meeting the man's appetites and the man's needs. So, indeed, right? What's going on here? Well, I mean, when you think about it, as MacKinnon is putting it, this is how pornography. This is the kind of pornography that pleases, that satisfies the male consumer. Indeed, as she argues, right, the physiological, emotional, psychological influence of all of these things that come together, frankly, ultimately in what the goal of all this is, right, which, as she puts it, is orgasm. That all of this contributes to that. How does all of this come to a satisfaction for the male who is consuming this material? It's through these ancient stereotypes that harm women, that view them as merely servants, as merely pleasers, as the subordinate one, as the one who is to be ordered around, as the one who is to be controlled in this matter. Right? It's her job as a subordinate to the male to do what it takes to satisfy the male here. So, as she sees it, pornography contributes to this. It maintains the stereotype, and it perpetuates this over and over and over again. How does Altman respond to that? Well, he responds by saying this. Well, there's really no evidence of a correlation or a cause between the amount of sexual inequality there is in the world and the availability of pornography. If you actually look at places where porn is available, you will find that in countries where there's more porn, there seems to also be more sexual equality. In places where pornography is actually sort of outlawed, where it's not available, you tend to find a lot more sexual inequality there. Some example of those could be the United States. Pornography is widely available here. I think it could be argued that although right, it's not ubiquitous all over the entire country, there's a great amount of sexual equality in this country. Look at Saudi Arabia. Pornography is not available. It is completely against the law to produce pornography in Saudi Arabia whatsoever. And it would be fair to say that women there are very much oppressed. I mean, just a year or two ago, they started allowing women to, for the first time ever, get a driver's license. If you're a woman there, you were not allowed to drive cars. You could not get a driver's license. So I don't know. I mean, this is sort of anecdotal, and Altman recognizes that. At least there seems to be some kind of correlation there in terms of um, where porn is available and how that where it is available, there seems to indeed be more sexual equality. What about a final criticism then? This particular criticism says this. Indeed, I think that this is something to maybe think about a little bit more here. I don't know personally, if I like Altman's response to this, just the logic of it, however it responds to it. Um, and the criticism goes like this. There are limits to porn as sexual autonomy. Here's why. It's not necessarily because it contributes to sexual inequality or that it contributes to sexual violence, but because the pornography itself is, in front of the camera lens, it is an actual instance of inequality. So think about it this way, and this is where I think pornography, and this is what Altman is getting at with this criticism, is that pornography indeed is a very different kind of media form from, let's just say, a really good movie, okay? A good fictional movie. Because the movie itself is fiction. But in pornography, you cannot fiction sex. You're actually engaging in sexual activity. It's actually happening. I mean, if it's what's called a hardcore or termed or in that sort of category as being indeed explicit and hardcore, where you see everything, that's an actual sexual engagement that is happening, right? That is being filmed here, and that's the point. Even though it's acting for the cameras, even though the people involved are really acting like they like each other in some way or acting out some sort of script or some sort of plot, when it comes down to it, women themselves indeed are subordinating themselves by allowing themselves to be treated in a certain way on camera, penetrated in that way on camera. I don't mean to get too explicit here, but this is the point that we're trying to make with this criticism that Alvin's trying to respond to here. Is that indeed, at the end of the day, there's no such thing as acting out sex in an explicit pornographic film. You are doing sex in the film. And so, indeed, if the woman is acting subordinate, if she's taking the role of being the one to be controlled sexually here in front of the camera, then indeed she is being sexually controlled on that stage, on that movie set, however you want to put it there. Hence, at the end of the day, this is a direct harm because it's actually creating, it's actually making porn that makes female inequality. It's not just depicting it, it's actually doing it. It's actually subordinating the woman here in front of the camera. How does Altman respond to this? Well, even if much porn indeed involves women doing degrading and humiliating acts, even if it involves actual harms that are being done, they still have the right to do it. They still have the right to participate in it. And the rest of us have the right to view it. If harm is being done, if inequality is being produced, we have, apparently, with Altman's criticism here, or his responses, we have the right to create that inequality, to create that subordination, to create that harm. It's just the right that we have given our overarching right of sexual autonomy. So even if some harm is done, that does not negate our right via sexual autonomy to engage in it. So anyway, that's all I've got for you for today. Does anybody have any questions about this argument, this position, these criticisms, Altman's responses? Any thoughts or criticisms or concerns that you have? Well, I guess I will take the silence as instructive that there are none. Well, if you do have questions about this week or thoughts, if you don't, feel free to email me. Shoot me an email. I'll be glad to think about it and respond and banter with you about this stuff. Always glad to do that. Have a good week, and we'll see you next time.